the nervous system in the body is very intelligent and is based off of survival, which means it is going to find a way.
Welcome to the Spartan Endurance Series on Spartan Up Podcast with host Johnny Waite.
Hey Spartans, we are back with another podcast episode, Spartan Endurance, on the Spartan Up Podcast. And I'm really excited. Johnny Waite here. I am with Dr. Emily Splickel from Arizona, from New York, but by wherever Arizona now.
This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by FitAid. Race dirty, recover clean with FitAid Sports Recovery Drink. Visit lifeaidbevco.com and enter the code SPARTAN30 at checkout to get 30% off their full line of functional lifestyle beverage blends and Go powder sticks.
Emily, I want to make sure I have this correct. You are a podiatrist, but a functional podiatrist and human movement specialist. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep. So I look at the integrated function of the human being versus the foot in isolation, which is how people typically will think about podiatry.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think podiatry, I think feet. So you're talking about feet as a part of a whole. Is that how you'd explain that?
100%. And I actually look at all of my patients, do a gait assessment, overhead squat, step up, step down. I talk a lot about core strength, glute strength, the timing of stabilization between their feet and their core. So that's why really the human movement specialist side really blends into my practice.
And it feels like the last decade, suddenly we're putting a lot more attention on this, on running, on the foot, on how it all works. I feel like, up until 10, 15 years ago, running just meant going really fast, right? Like your gym teacher just said, throw that foot, then that foot, then that foot. And it felt like running clinics, there was not really much focus on form. It was more just a matter of building up your endurance. And I feel like that probably did a lot of damage to a lot of people over those years as we just went out and just went harder. Is that fair to say? And how is this a reaction to that?
Yeah, so I feel that there's been a big shift in looking at running more so than you run to run well, right? So you have to, what else are you doing? What's the footwear? What's your strike pattern? What's your recovery? How are you strengthening your feet and your core? I credit a lot of that to the barefoot running boom. And a lot of listeners may or may not be quote unquote barefoot runners or minimal runners. But it brought this attention to start to question what people are doing in the running space, but particularly in the endurance running space, because the demands are so high and the repetitive demands of impact. So you have to really break it down and say, well, what's going on with the body? How does it perceive impact? How does it do this over and over thousands of times during one running session? I've actually dedicated my career to really studying the neuroscience side of movement, such as running.
And that's a really great point. When you talk about endurance and people think of running as bursts, like I think, running means you're getting away from something, you're going as fast as you can. And, but, obviously when you think about marathons, ultra marathons, and the idea of, if you're going to run 100 kilometers, you're going to run 100,000 strikes at least. And, that's a lot of repetitive movement. So if you're going into it with a compromised foot, with a compromised strike, with compromised footwear, things like that, you're almost setting yourself up for guaranteed injury. So how do we start to correct that? I guess I'll dive right in. And I just want to give you, you understand Spartan racing and you understand endurance, and you know the world we're coming from. And like I say, this podcast is more geared towards the people who are going further, so the longer distances.
Yes. Well, again, I don't have to be an endurance runner to understand the energy demands of endurance training. And then a majority of my patients are endurance athletes. So I think one of the most important things off the gate is for that the listeners understand that endurance running or endurance activities are fascial-based, which means that they're based off of this efficient energy transfer, kind of like a rubber band or a kangaroo. Kangaroos are actually studied a lot for their elastic energy. And we then want to ask ourselves, well, how do we stay fascial in our movement versus muscular in our movement? And a lot of that has to do with the foot, because the foot is perceiving the ground and the impact forces. So it's really the step one in this process. And if you are disconnected from your feet, disconnected from the ground, you're not timing or anticipating this response, then you start to become more muscular and disjointed in your movements. So that's where minimal footwear also comes into play, and making sure that your movement is as efficient or graceful or rhythmic as possible. Some of the biggest things that will detract runners or athletes from this is prior injury. Probably the biggest one, because they're little monkey wrenches in the coordination of our movement. And then thick shoes, structured shoes can also do that. And then kind of just this lack of consciousness of the way that your body moves. So I always want people to actually tune into their movement, be present in their movement versus distracted and all the way over here. So those are some of the big things that come to mind when you say that.
And when I think about endurance running and the idea about, people say, how can you run a long way? And part of it is that sort of conscious mindfulness, that you're present to what you're doing. So how do people, where do they start? So somebody goes out and they try and go for a long run and their feet are killing them and their back hurts and they don't feel like they're cut out for it. What are they doing wrong and how do they correct that?
Yeah, so let's look at foot strength and then foot recovery. If someone who's listening is experiencing certain injuries, or they're feeling that they're having a hard time hitting that peak efficiency that I was speaking about, then I would say, okay, let's take a step back, look at your foot. And there's actually three areas that I look at: is how sensory sensitive is your foot, how strong is your foot, and then how recovered is your foot. From a sensory sensitive, that means that you have to either do barefoot movements, get out of your shoes, get out of everything that is a barrier between your feet and the ground. That's actually why I founded my company, Nabosa, which are textured insoles and textured socks, because I'm forcing people to feel their feet. You could walk outside on different surfaces to feel the irregularity, but that's the sensory side, right? And I want people to get at least 30 minutes of sensory stimulation to their feet every day. Second part, which is the strength, is, are you doing intentional foot strengthening? This could be Pilates, yoga. Those are barefoot workouts, right? So that's kind of the easiest way to say it. But I actually teach a lot of intentional barefoot exercises. One of the easiest is called short foot. So the listeners can Google short foot or YouTube short foot and you will see videos on it. But here's the big thing with foot strength, is that functional foot strength is strength that is connected to your core, which means that if you're doing like toe crunches or towel crunches over there to strengthen your feet and you're not actually integrating it, it's kind of like doing a bicep curl and then not being stronger at a pull-up. Like that, it has to be an integrated exercise, right? So that's how I look at the strength. And then from the recovery is that you have to be releasing your feet 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening at a minimum. And that could be standing on a golf ball, lacrosse ball, something to just release. And this is even if you don't have foot pain. You still want to look at your foot as this foundation of opportunity.
And when you talk about releasing the foot and the golf ball or the tennis ball and the lacrosse ball is the Canadian I think about, that's the structure of the bottom of the foot, right? And you and I talked a little bit at the start of this about plantar fasciitis, or about the plantar fascia. So how does that tie into all this?
Yes. So your plantar fascia, which is the thick band of tissue that runs across the bottom of the foot, I'm sure some of the listeners know it because they probably had plantar fasciitis at some point, is a rubber band. It's a way that we transfer energy. And the way that we do that when we run is through arch compression. So this is your arch, you strike the ground and your foot is going to flatten a little bit. When it does that, it stretches the fascia. And then when you pick your foot up to run, to take a step, your arch recoils up with the plantar fascia. So that stretching and recoiling of arch compression is a really important part of moving efficiently, being a rubber band, using your fascia, not your muscles, as the way for endurance running. Now, if you don't have healthy fascia or elastic fascia, what happens is you start to micro tear it. This is actually every connective tissue in the body, not just your plantar fascia. And then that little micro tearing, you just get into these vicious little cycles, and the fascia can start to degenerate. And then I will tell patients nicely that I'm like, your tissue is like a dried out rubber band. And I'm sure people have seen a dried out rubber band, right? It's kind of fraying a little bit. And then you give too much of a stretch and it goes boop and it tears. And I treat many plantar fascial tears in my office because they got into this cycle. So I do a lot of education to get people before they get to that point through healthy daily habits and movement practices.
It's funny, years ago I struggled with plantar fasciitis, and at the time I was told the only cure is rest. You just need to rest long enough, which is very hard for somebody who likes to go and do things. So you would rest, but then once you had rested enough to move again, you started moving the way you moved before, which is what caused the plantar fasciitis in the first place, and did nothing to actually strengthen the plantar fasciitis or the plantar fascia. And it just became this horrible cycle of run, get hurt, rest, don't rest long enough, get hurt, rest longer, run again. And so it's funny, I'm standing in my office in my bare feet. I have my ball below my desk that I always have. So a lot of what you're talking about is the stuff that over the past few years I have fortunately stumbled upon. In terms of that strengthening, and I love your description of, that you're not just doing curls, it's not in isolation. And I think about when you talk about the barefoot movement and when barefoot shoes came out, the Vibrams and all the different things that came out, I think a lot of people thought, well, this is the solution. If I just put on these barefoot shoes, suddenly I'll be running properly. And I know part of the problem was they continued to run improperly without the support and cushioning they were used to, which was never doing them any favors in the first place. But, they developed all these bad habits with that and then went straight into no support and no cushioning. So if somebody is really thinking, hey, this all sounds great, maybe I have some actual optimism I could become an endurance runner now that I hear all this. Mm-hmm. How would you suggest they start? Like what should they be doing as far as getting that baseline foot function to begin with? What kind of shoes should they be starting with? Take me through that.
Yes, definitely don't go from the super structured supportive to a minimal, zero drop, no cushion shoe, and then run the same distance. Exactly like what you're saying, sure. Which is unfortunately what a majority of people and like mass consumers did with that footwear. And then it did get, bad press around it.
Yep. Sure.
And it's not the shoe. It was the transition and the lack of knowledge within the space that the shoe is just this interface or this conduit, but you still have to rely on the natural foot strength and understand recovery. I mean, that really is the biggest part. And so much of my career is also focused on teaching people to passively recover their feet, because you're using them when you stand. So you're using them right now, right? Standing.
Sure.
And then when you walk around, and then when you train, and then when you run. So they're just getting like a massive beating. So the transition from a structured shoe to a more minimal shoe, if that's what people want to do to try to tap into sensory stimulation, foot strength, and fascial efficiency, is I would say to gradually decrease the structure of the shoe. And you have, thick traditional cushion shoe. I'll use like a New Balance as an example.
Yep.
And then you have more of this transitional shoe, which will have a little less drop, a little less cushion. It won't have a stiff midsole through it, and they typically don't have counters in the back of them. That would be like Ultra is a really good example. So Ultra and On Running is another one. New Balance has some that are a little bit more transitional, so that's where you could find that. And then there's obviously all the way minimal zero drop, which would be like Zero Shoes, Vivo Barefoot, the Vibram 5 Fingers. So you have this step. So first, going to that transition, start by doing your lifts, your maybe some of a shorter run, maybe some box jumps, whatever you're doing that's not this long endurance run. That's introducing stress in this less supported environment. Now, here's the most important part here, this recovery window. You got to give your feet and your body a window to actually show the stress that you just put it under. I'm sure you've heard of DOMS, right? So delayed onset muscle soreness,
Yep.
right? So of course it's like you just did a killer workout. Next day you're like, oh my God. No. Wait until 48 hours.
Yeah, the next
Then
day.
you're like, oh my God, right? So same thing with stress to your feet is if you go for a run in more minimal shoes and you're like, I feel great. I had no problems going to this minimal shoe. I'm going to do the exact same thing the next day. No, you have to give it this 48-hour window to start to show face. And it's essentially, it's just the inflammatory cycle that you're allowing to kind of hit its peak. If you feel fine, you can reintroduce that stimulus, the same stimulus, 48 hours later, take that same couple day break, and then reintroduce the same stimulus. So you do that. After you do that for, let's say, 3-4 times, you can then increase the stimulus, which means run a little further, maybe do a little bit more dynamic, or you bring the days a little closer together. So you want to progressively introduce stress, right? And then at the same time, you're doing intentional foot strengthening. Again, look up short foot. I have tons of videos on YouTube about short foot. And then you're doing the 5-minute foot release morning and evening. So that's kind of a general way that I could do it. And I actually write 3-month protocols for patients that are trying to transition after an injury back into functional foot status, or are trying to transition from a supportive shoe to a more minimal shoe.
We'll be right back to this conversation, but first, a little bit from today's sponsor, FitAid. FitAid is a clean sports recovery drink. Race dirty, recover clean. You've heard us say it before. FitAid is 45 calories, certified non-GMO tested, vegan, paleo-friendly, certified gluten-free, kosher, and never contains any artificial colors, flavors, sweeteners, or sodium. Even the zero sugar option, it's keto-friendly and has only 5 calories, and it's naturally sweetened with monk fruit and stevia. And then there's FitAid's Recovery Blend. It has glutamine, glucosamine, turmeric, BCAAs, omega-3s, CoQ10, a full B complex, and electrolytes. It's perfect for after your workout, your hike, your bike ride, or your race. Can you imagine drinking a plain old soda when you could have this? FitAid is a product of LifeAid, the functional beverage company, and they're an official partner of our Spartan Race series. Listen, each ice-cold can of FitAid, it contains ingredients to help your body recover, and it never contains any artificial flavors or sweeteners. So visit lifeaidbevco.com, enter the code Spartan30 at checkout, and save 30%, plus you get fast, free shipping. Okay, back to the interview.
And so once somebody gets to where they're running properly, that they're not overstriding and hyper extending their plantar fasciitis or plantar fascia. I always say plantar fasciitis. Obviously, I've been traumatized. I can't say plantar fascia without throwing the itis on the end. But so they are, like you say, using a more fascial movement, and they have built up the strength. Really, there isn't a problem with running far, is there? If you're running properly and you've built up the strength and you're wearing proper footwear, you can run as far as you can run. You're not going to hurt yourself just by the act of running anymore, are you?
Yeah, I mean, we were designed to run long distance, right? And if you think we're in the wild chasing the wild game for our meals, right? Like we were designed to run long distances. Now,
yeah.
That goes back to the first thing that I'd said. We are designed to run far distances or long distances if we stay fascial. And that's the most important thing, right? The biggest monkey wrench is you start to get an injury. And plantar fasciitis is one of the most frustrating ones. And you could probably vouch that you could say, I maybe now have a ceiling on the distance that I can run, and then things start talking to me, right? Like maybe your foot starts to talk to you, maybe your leg, your IT band, something like that. And that's where, really addressing these injuries from a integrated perspective and I definitely don't take the philosophy of no pain, no gain. I'm sure all the listeners are
Sure.
like, no, that's not the Spartan way, right? But, when you have an injury history and you do push past this point
Yeah.
and you're of a certain age, things just don't recoil back as much. And, again, it's just years of experience of practicing and really specializing in that. So most of what I treat is chronic tissue injuries in my practice. And then another big part of what I do is actually regenerative medicine for a lot of these chronic tissue injuries, to try to get the tissue back to this younger state that is more like a rubber band again.
Yep. Yeah, and that's I was just going to say that, a lot of what you're talking about, the nice thing is it's a pretty low bar, as far as, it's not like somebody needs to, set aside weeks and hours a day. They just, 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night, doing the exercises, doing the research, and transitioning through the shoes is going to get the average person to where they need to be. But I also appreciate that you said there will be some people who've got themselves to the point where there is intervention needed, where they actually have damaged themselves to the point where they need to come see someone like you who can actually correct that as well. And I actually want to give you an opportunity to tell them how to get in touch with you, because that's an important part of this as well. But I wanted to ask an analogy that I use when I'm talking to people about barefoot running, and of course barefoot running doesn't always mean running in your bare feet, although I love to do that, and I do find that when I run in my bare feet, it forces me to run properly, because you can't land with too much impact. You can't run recklessly, because you get that immediate sensory input on the bottom of your foot from roots and sticks and stones. And you have to become a much kinder, more intentional, thoughtful runner, because you're not blocking all of that. And, when I talk to friends in their great big thick shoes, they say all of that immediate sensation that would actually autocorrect, you've blunted to the point where it's not until it's in your hip and there's a lot of force by the time it gets there that you're noticing it. And you go run a marathon on the road on a flat surface with shoes, and at the end of it go, oh, why is my back completely torqued? Because everything that would have told you that you're doing it wrong, you blunted. So I always suggest people, even if you're not going to race barefoot and run barefoot, just go run barefoot a bit, and you'll actually figure out very quickly what you should be doing. But what I want to ask you is, if somebody at birth had their parents put them in mittens, and they had all different mittens, they had dress mittens that were super tight and leather, and they had, they had all these mittens their whole life. And then at 30, they decided they wanted to become very good at something that involved hand function. It wouldn't work out very well, would it?
So, yes, if from the earliest phase or period you put mittens on, shoes, yes. So you are taking away that sensory stimulation. Now, what I will say is that the nervous system in the body is very intelligent and is based off of survival, which means it is going to find a way, right?
Yep.
So it will maybe, you will probably have surprising, good, decent function in your hands, but obviously not like if you didn't have mittens on, right? But you would find a way, your brain would find a way, your nervous system would, right? Now, what I often will say to that analogy with the shoes and minimal movement and barefoot stimulation and barefoot movement is that for people that have been shod or in shoes a majority of their life from, earliest age to, maybe they're 60 now or something like that, and they wear shoes even in their house, let's say, right, is they don't know what they don't know, right? So what they think is normal movement, normal sensation of their feet, normal transfer of energy, right, which is really subpar or sub-optimized, right? They don't know any difference. So when you look at the research, or when I work with professional athletes or coaches and trainers who then work with the athletes, is that there is this enlightening moment when they actually realize, oh, wait, my foot actually has that much function. My foot has that much sensation. My foot affects my knees, my back, my hips, right? So there's this like aha or light bulb. And then the funny thing is that they can't go back. Once they realize that, and that's why I love this. I've been traveling the world teaching about barefoot for over 10 years and just seeing people's response to it. And there's so many research studies that they'll do, barefoot movement prep with athletes, then put the shoes on and then play soccer or whatever it is that they're doing. And then there's always this disclaimer at the end of the research study that says, all the subjects wanted to continue the barefoot movement because they were like, now that I know this exists, I need to keep doing it. So yes, there's this adaptability, right? So everyone who's listening, if you're running in thick supportive shoes, you're still running, right? So it's not like you're tripping over your feet. Your brain and your nervous system finds a way. Now, is it as optimized as it could be if you were minimal or barefoot? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, explore. Try to be barefoot.
Yeah. And the idea that they're going to, a football player is going to put those shoes back on to play football. You're not going to have people playing football barefoot. But the idea that, to take that glove off or to take that shoe off, that's where, you're not going to go work out with mittens on. You're going to, and so the idea about freeing your feet up, getting them stronger, whatever, then when you put them back in the shoes, you've done the work. So yeah, I appreciate that you developing my crude analogy into something that's useful. Thank you.
Yes. And if I could actually add, Johnny, because I know your listeners have to be wondering this, is all of the maximal shoes that are out there, like Hoka, because they're very, very trendy. I was just at the running event in Texas, and this is, 2022 trends for running. Every shoe company was maximal and ultra running, right? Ultra marathons. It's very trendy right now for people to be doing ultra marathons. And what you had just said about the football player in their cleats, right? They're going to go into their cleats. So if you are doing ultra distances, right, the demands are a little bit different, perhaps, or you might have a stress threshold that you hit because ultra distances, it is a little bit starting to hit beyond physiology, right? Those distances.
Sure. Yeah.
So then still wear your Hoka then, right? But what are you doing before you put on your Hoka? What are you doing after you get out of your Hoka? What are you doing on your non-long distance running days, right? So that still is this other part of what we've been speaking about, still has to be part of your regimen, and not just saying, well, I'm running ultra distances that the thick cushion is absorbing the impact, so I have no problems, so I don't get overuse injuries. We still need to kind of find that balance.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with the Hokas, I the idea it is zero drop, so you're getting that benefit, but you're right that it's not giving you that sensation at all. It's blocking it. So I agree that it's still not going to teach you to run properly. You still need to learn to run properly. But once you're running properly, once you've got yourself in a proper barefoot stride, once you've got yourself doing things the way you need to do, then it's a wonderful tool to allow you to extend it further. But it's the exact same problem in the other direction, where people used to buy Vibram 5 fingers, which I love, except that it doesn't teach you to run better. So you're going to keep getting hurt unless you learn to run better. And the exact same going the other direction. You're going to put these on and say, wow, now I have zero drops in cushioning, I can run 1,000 miles. No, not at all, because you're still doing it wrong. So yeah, I agree. It's really in your bare feet that you're going to learn to run well, and that you're going to be able to exercise and get that function, and then transition that, and then transfer that new talent into this protective tool, and it's going to benefit you. Cool. Hey, I want to tell people how to get in touch with you. So first of all, for somebody who wants to just tap into your knowledge, through YouTube, through lectures, things like that, where are they going to find you online? But also for the person who says, I really want to go deep on this, whether they want to get your one-on-one coaching, or if it's somebody who really actually needs intervention, how do they find you?
Yeah, so my podiatry practice is my name. So dremilysplichal.com. Sorry if it's complicated.
Spell Splickel for us.
Splichal. So dremilysplichal.com. But you could also just Google Dr. Emily Podiatry. It'll come up. I do virtual consultations. So actually a majority of my patients are virtual, so everyone
Hmm.
can know that. I've treated many
You don't
Spartan
need to live in
athletes.
Phoenix, Arizona.
And or those that want to travel or live in Phoenix. So that's my practice, functional and regenerative podiatry. And then for my philosophy on movement and a lot of my programming, you can go to barefootstrong.com. And that will start to kind of open up stuff that I have done. I wrote a book called Barefoot Strong. It's available on Amazon. And then if you Google or YouTube Dr. Emily Feet, everything will come up. I'm a strong believer in content. So there is tons of content on the internet for people to understand their feet and learn the exercises. And then I also train professionals as well.
Fantastic. That is the whole gamut. I appreciate that. Hey, thank you so much. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I absolutely love barefoot hiking, barefoot walking, barefoot running. And I love that I can never explain the science as well as someone like you. So I love having this opportunity to draw that out and expand my knowledge, but more importantly to be able to say, see, this person knows what they're talking about, and they're telling you this. So thank you so much, and I look forward to having you back on at some point too on the podcast.
Absolutely, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Endurance Series on Spartan Up Podcast. Spartan Up is your partner in resilience for mind, body, and spirit. We're here 3 days every week. Tuesdays, you can find Joe DeSena, founder and CEO of Spartan, interviewing biohackers, business leaders, authors, and athletes. Thursdays and Saturdays, catch episodes from our DECA, Endurance, Trail, Combat, and La Ruta series. Do you know someone who needs a little nudge? Maybe they could use some motivation, tactics to be stronger, healthier, happier, more successful. Tell them about our show. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment. We want to know who's watching and who's listening. Thanks. See you next time. This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by FitAid. Race dirty, recover clean with FitAid Sports Recovery Drink. Visit lifeaidbevco.com and enter the code Spartan30 at checkout to get 30% off their full line of functional lifestyle beverage blends and Go powder sticks.